On July 26, 1944, 3 miles south of St. Lo, France, Staff Sergeant Frank Novak stood beside his Sherman tank staring at a briefing that read not like orders but like an execution notice written in numbers, because the mathematics of armored warfare were brutally honest in ways propaganda never was. A German Tiger tank, with its long-barreled 88mm gun, could destroy Novak's M4 Sherman from well over a mile away, punching through American frontal armor as if it were thin sheet metal, while Novak's own 75mm gun required him to close to under 300 yards, 3 football fields, just to have a chance of penetrating the Tiger's frontal plate, and even then only with a perfect hit on a weak point like the turret ring or lower glacis, and that meant crossing open ground under a weapon that fired faster, flatter, and deadlier than anything the Sherman had been designed to face. The briefing listed confirmed losses in cold, impersonal ink, noting that in the previous 48 hours a single Tiger operating near Hill 192 had destroyed 11 Allied tanks, 11 crews, 55 men, numbers that Frank Novak couldn't stop converting in his head into faces, voices, jokes told over mess tins, letters half-written to wives and mothers, because Novak had once worked in Detroit at the Arsenal of Democracy, where Shermans rolled off assembly lines in predictable rhythms. 1 every hour, 5 for every German tank, a triumph of American industrial logic built on the idea that quantity could compensate for vulnerability, that speed of production could offset individual loss, and back then those numbers had felt reassuring, abstract, almost elegant, but here in Normandy they translated into the knowledge that he and his crew were statistically expendable, a deliberate trade made by men far from hedgerows and burning fields. Doctrine said advance in line, suppress with smoke, concentrate fire, trust numbers, but Novak knew Doctrine had been written by officers who studied schematics instead of graves, and as he stood beside Lucky Strike, his Sherman named in bitter humor by his loader, he felt the weight of that realization settle into his bones, because the numbers no longer lived on paper but in the soil around him, scorched black by burned-out hulks that still smelled of fuel and cooked flesh. The morning air on July 24th was cool and damp, thick with the smell of diesel fuel, churned mud, and the faint sweetness of crushed hedgerow leaves, and Novak leaned against the rounded hull of his M4A1 watching his breath fog in the early light while trying to finish a letter to his wife Rose, a letter he had started and crossed out 3 times already. Because there was no way to explain that after weeks in Normandy, the worst part wasn't the fighting but the waiting that let fear grow teeth, the waiting that gave his mind time to calculate angles, ranges, probabilities, and survival percentages until sleep became impossible. Around him his crew moved through their morning ritual with practiced precision, because ritual was the only thing that kept panic at bay. Jamie Walsh, barely 22. Cleaning the gun breech with meticulous care and humming a hymn under his breath the way he always did when he was nervous. Rodriguez checking his watch and then checking it again as if time itself could be coaxed into cooperation. Chen silent and focused, already visualizing approach routes and distances in his head the way some men pictured baseball fields or hometown streets, and Novak watched them all with the heavy knowledge that Doctrine might send these men into a fight they mathematically could not win. At 0700 hours Battalion S2 called the tank commanders to briefing, and Novak walked across the muddy assembly area with 11 other sergeants and lieutenants, men who had learned to read exhaustion and fear in each other's faces without needing words, because nobody joked this morning, nobody smoked, nobody complained, and Captain Morrison stood beside the map board looking older than Novak remembered. His uniform wrinkled, his eyes rimmed red from too many nights without sleep, a man carrying the weight of every casualty report he had signed since North Africa, and when Morrison spoke his voice was flat, deliberate, the voice of a man delivering information he wished did not exist. Confirmation of a Tiger operating near Hill 192, call sign Iron Ghost, commanded by Oberleutnant Karl Brandt, a veteran tanker with 47 confirmed kills since Tunisia. And as Morrison pulled down side-by-side schematics of the Sherman and the Tiger, Novak felt a familiar tightening in his chest, because he had seen these diagrams before in training back in Detroit, had memorized the specifications the way a machinist memorized tolerances, but seeing them here, under canvas, within artillery range, made them feel different, heavier, more personal. Morrison recited the numbers like a ledger. Sherman frontal armor 51 mm, side armor 38. Tiger frontal armor 100 mm, side armor 80. Sherman 75 mm penetration 68 mm. At 500 yards, Tiger 88 mm penetration well beyond 2000. And then came the line Novak couldn't forget. You will need to close to under 300 yards for a kill, and even then you must hit perfectly. And Novak did the math in his head the same way he once calculated production bottlenecks, realizing that the Tiger could kill them long before they could even see it. That Doctrine required them to feed themselves into its sights one at a time. When Jamie asked what if they didn't go head-on, Morrison shut it down immediately, because Doctrine existed for a reason, and deviation meant chaos, court-martial, friendly fire, and Novak understood that too, understood the logic. But logic that ignored new variables wasn't logic at all, it was inertia, and as the commanders filed out into the rain Novak gathered his crew and spoke quietly, telling them the truth without drama. If they followed Doctrine, they were dead, but if they didn't, the consequences were his to bear. And as he touched the folded letter to Rose in his breast pocket, he felt the unbearable tension between obedience and responsibility settle over him like armor that didn't quite fit. The next morning, July 25th, the American column advanced through the Norman hedgerows in perfect formation, 5 Shermans spaced 50 yards apart, exactly as prescribed, engines rumbling, tracks clanking, radios crackling with static and clipped commands, and through the narrow vision slits Novak saw a world reduced to green walls of earth and foliage, lanes barely wide enough for a tank, visibility collapsing to less than 50 yards, terrain that negated numbers and favored ambush, and the sound came first, not a boom like artillery but a sharp, violent crack that cut through the morning air like the snap of a giant whip, followed instantly by the sight of Rawhide 1 erupting in flame as an 88 mm round punched clean through its frontal plate, igniting ammunition and fuel in a fraction of a second, the tank ceasing to exist as a fighting vehicle before its crew could even react. And Novak felt his mouth go dry as Rawhide 3 surged forward trying to spot the shooter. Doctrine insisting on advance and concentration, only to be obliterated moments later at 1600 yards, its turret torn loose, men bailing out screaming as their uniforms burned, and Novak slammed his fist against the driver's shoulder ordering reverse, the Sherman lurching backward into a sunken lane as smoke and fire filled the approach, because there was nothing else to do, no target to shoot, no enemy to see. Just the terrible certainty that somewhere beyond the hedgerows a tiger sat hull down, calm, patient, dominating the geometry of the battlefield. 800 meters away, Oberleutnant Karl Brandt watched through his ice optics, the world sharp and precise despite the distance, because German engineering excelled at clarity, and he called ranges calmly, professionally, as his gunner adjusted for wind and elevation, the 88 mm KWK-36 responding like a finely tuned instrument, muzzle velocity high, trajectory flat, time to target measured in seconds, and Brandt counted rounds expended and fuel remaining even as Sherman's burned. Because experience had taught him that superiority was temporary, dependent on logistics and terrain, and even invincible machines eventually ran out of advantages. Brandt noticed something that morning, something subtle but unsettling, American tanks probing different approach routes instead of feeding straight into the killing ground, and he filed that observation away, because adaptation was dangerous. Back in the sunken lane, Novak pressed his back against the turret wall breathing hard, the metallic smell of spent rounds and hot oil filling the cramped interior, his crew silent, shaken, Jamie's hands trembling on the gun controls, and Novak realized with absolute clarity that the problem wasn't courage or firepower but geometry, that the Tiger dominated only so long as it controlled angles and timing, that its turret traverse was slow, its side armor thinner, and that if 3 Shermans could arrive simultaneously from different directions, forcing the Tiger to split attention, the math would change, and that night at 0200 hours, unable to sleep, Novak sat in his tent sketching lines and angles by flashlight, turning battlefield chaos into a solvable equation the way he once turned factory inefficiencies into production gains, calculating speeds, distances, turret rotation times, and radio synchronization until the impossible began to look merely difficult.